In other words, it's a strange battle between the world that we once knew, where men were celebrated but part of a larger harmonious society, and the world in which men are are downgraded, denied, and to be overthrown. And this is an existential battle.
This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius. Germanicus is here. We turn to Make America Great Again. An observer noticed that Make America Great Again has the suggestion of the heroic age. An observer commented that the heroic age is upsetting to many of the voters in the 21st century, not only in America, but in Europe as well. The heroic age is reckless. The heroic age is the rage of the whole Iliad, not just Achilles. All of the Iliad is rage. All those battles in front of Troy. That's both rage and heroism. Heroes in the Iliad can be extremely reckless, hence Paris. Now, here we are in the 21st century, and no one is comfortable with heroes. We're comfortable with any heroes. We've seen them in movies for 100 years. But heroes, that's a stretch. That's like asking people to go backwards in time to celebrate something they can't explain. I welcome Germanicus to comment because you can't be certain that Make America Great Again is the age of heroism. You can say a couple of things about it, though. If it is heroism, it might explain some of the unhappiness of the optimates, of the blue team, who are management. It might explain why Labour Party in Britain, uniformly successful in the most recent election, is said to be sending, the number of 100 is used, of its representatives, some of the members of parliament, to America to assist the victory of Kamala Harris if it's to happen. It is not Great Britain sending them. It is what is joked about in London as Little Britain sending to Little America. Now, this is all speculation, so I turn to Germanicus and his thoughts. Germanicus, once we enjoyed, you and I, the Redeemer Nation metaphor, because it fits what the events of 1944, it fits the events of many of the interventions in American history. Vicksburg, for example, or the second day at Gettysburg. However, what we have now is a country that's divided between the optimates, the senatorial class, and their candidate Harris, and the plebes. The plebes have no particular style. We call it populism. The plebes can be hectic and disorganized, and the plebes can make mistakes. But plebes recognize heroes. I don't know that the optimates do. That would make them uncomfortable. Caesar was a form of a hero, and we know that didn't come out well. So how do you measure Make America Great Again? Is that about the age of heroism, or is that mockery? Good evening to you, Germanicus.
Good evening, Gaius. America has always been a vision founded on the heroic ethos. It isn't an age of heroes. It's a sensibility of the heroic. And in fact, the American Revolution, go up and down the American Revolution from alpha to omega, and it's heroism at every step. Sacrifice, I mean, Nathan Hale, you can go on and on. Dr. Warren, everything about the American Revolution was heroic. And America was a heroic ethos that looked to antecedents in literary homage, like the Iliad, but not to be the Iliad, not to be that rage or wrath-filled world of the Bronze Age, but rather to take the essence of the heroic as as Homer captured it and make that a part of a modern civilized world. And it was successful. It was so triumphantly successful that America became the dominant force in world affairs as a heroic vision, but a heroic vision that was not rooted in Bronze Age principles, but rather in Enlightenment principles and a heroic vision that was tamed to a moral vision that came from God. And this is the vision that today's optimates cannot stand, because the optimates, which is the ruling class in America today, are a vision, an ethos created and nurtured and now grown to full maturity through the wiles and percolations of feminism into what I would call a therapeutic ethos. And the therapeutic ethos is the complete counterpoint, the mirror opposite of the heroic ethos. In the therapeutic ethos, people don't have agency. They are all, to some extent or another, victims, and if they're not, they are oppressors. And it is a passive and, well, frankly, the therapeutic ethos has its source in the satirical novel of Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, and it is the regnant ethos of the ruling class in America. And yet, as you so correctly noted, the plebs, the vast majority of Americans, still hew to the heroic ethos, men and women alike, and they want a heroic America. And so the tremendous driver today in this election can, in fact, be linked to the central trope, the driver of all of the action in Homer's Iliad, which was, in fact, simply distilled down to the wrath of a single man, the ultimate man, if you will, the wrath of Achilles. And the wrath of Achilles today is the wrath of American men who have, in the last several decades, but increasingly since 2013, been the abused and the injured. And they have been discarded and downtrodden and discriminated against. And they are now in a position where they are hurting badly. I mean, you have over 60% of all colleges are women. The job force is increasingly discriminating against men, and men are in a position, especially heroic men, of being discarded and discriminated against. And this is the framing of the contemporary dynamic behind this election. In other words, you have an election in which you have not only the wrath of men who have been abused and injured, but those men at the same time, and this must be said, are the plebs. In other words, regular guys and their families and their wives are up in arms against what is being done to them. And on the other hand, in the therapeutic ethos and its regnant world of yuppies and the elite, dominated by that therapeutic ethos, men are accommodating, they are supine, they're the new man who isn't a man. They are the soft eunuch-like men of the new world. And this is a very stark, I'm painting it in rather existential opposition, and rather starkly, because it is stark and it is real, and because people don't want to own up to it, doesn't mean that it isn't the driving factor. Dynamis in Greek means power. It is the power driving American society towards some sort of outcome, some sort of confrontation. In other words, it's a strange battle between the world that we once knew, where men were celebrated but part of a larger harmonious society, and the world in which men are downgraded, denied, and to be overthrown. And this is an existential battle.
That won't stop with an election. You're talking about a transformation of a culture into the skill set of the elite, of the educated, of the gifted, of the what do they call them? Experts. And that isn't going to stop with one election. That will continue. The 100 members of labor, just quickly, a minute. Is that ironical? I mean, what do we make of it? We rescued Britain twice in the 20th century, and it means to rescue us. Is that what this is about? Sort of Lafayette, we're here. Now it's sort of George Washington, we're here.
It's a bit like a repeat in very shallow ways of the original American Revolution, because, we're still part of an Anglo-American world in which you have a British Empire, meaning UK, Ireland,
right,
Australia, New Zealand, and now what Great Britain is doing, or at least Great Britain's new regnant authority is doing, is very similar to.
Is it self-aware?
It's a 18th century condescension. You can learn from us. We will come and help you. We will help those Tories among you who have the awakened vision that is correct for the future.
Let's turn to Europe and the battles in Eurasia. We have an example of something that happened in the 13th century BCE in northern Germany that is extremely suggestive of what's happening in Ukraine today, the Eurasian Wars. And we are looking at a new research just published in one of the publications of antiquity. Investigations in the Tolensi Valley in northeastern Germany have provided evidence of a large and violent conflict in the 13th century BCE. The evidence is 10 flint and 54 bronze specimens of arrowheads, and comparison with type distributions in Central Europe, presented here for the first time, which emphasize the supra-regional nature of the conflict. Supra-regional is one of those academic words that means some elements of the battle came from outside the locals. There are locals there, but there's some elements, there's some technologies, there's some presence that didn't grow up here. We can tell from their teeth. They weren't children here. While the flint arrowheads are typical for the local Nordic Bronze Age, that's the gang that lives there, the bronze arrowheads show a mixture of local and non-local forms, adding to the growing evidence for a clash between local groups and at least one incoming group from southern Central Europe. Read Napoleon of the 13th century BCE. Now, the evidence is in. I turned it immediately to Germanicus and said, this looks like imperialism. There'd be no reason to wander in northern Germany and take on local flint arrowhead young men unless you are meaning to conquer. There are mounds of skeletons that they have not yet unearthed. The ones they have, they provide evidence of how they died, the blows they took, blows, cuts, arrowheads. There's one vivid picture of a skull, the back of a skull, and the bronze arrowhead, barbed, has penetrated in the skull and it's just sticking there. It's been there for 3,000 years. This suggested to me that the Eurasian Wars that the Redeemer Nation, the United States, has been involved in at least since the 18th century, maybe the 17th century, right away. Those wars are part of living in Europe, and we now and again get caught up in them. And we're caught up in one now, just as we were caught up in 1917, just as we were caught up in 1942, and just as we were caught up again and again and again in the battle with the Soviet Union. So, Germanicus, this is the question I put to you. If these wars are perpetual, and it's our choice to get involved or not, that is the question that's being put before the American people now, right now. After the election, depending on the choice the American people make, there will be decisions about continuing Ukraine war with Russia. There will be decisions about continuing support for NATO's battle with the Russian Confederation of Tehran, Beijing, and Pyongyang. And one more time, we'll be faced with those who accuse the dissenters as being isolationists. Is there something comforting about this, that for 3,000 years this has been happening?
All that is comforting is the human continuity. And yet the human continuity is one of continuing bitter conflict in which one society seeks to bring another society to submission. And one of the most powerful themes that emerges from the Tolense Valley is, first of all, that the Bronze Age was more modern than we might think. Modern in the sense that there was a whole world stretching from Britain all the way to India that was bound and stitched together. And we don't think that that was the case, but it was. So obviously you had lots of interaction and interchange. Much of it was trade, but then there was movements of peoples, migrations and invasions that you see today. We live in an age of aggressive migration, and not very different from the end of the Bronze Age, which would come a century after this battle. But this battle is intense in the sense that it was a large battle, 3 to even 5,000 people, which is amazing for a time when the population was infinitely smaller, even than the height of Rome several centuries, many centuries later.
This would have been northern Germany's Troy, right? We're talking about the battle on the before the gates of Troy, except for
this is contemporaneous. This is at the same time, and you have enormous devastation and death. Now, this is a continuity that we should not be happy about. We see the downsides and the consequences today. Now, another thing that is so powerful about this is that whoever the invaders were had superior technology.
Right.
And they were able to inflict enormous losses on the poor guys who had merely flaked flint arrowheads and spears. But this speaks to what we're dealing with today in many ways with modern war, because
I saw the shaft, the Bronze shaft with the barbs. I saw that as Storm Shadow missile, right away.
Well, yes, but I mean, what is fascinating is that in all of the battles that we see from Tolense all the way to Ukraine, is that the technology is not always the deciding factor. It can be a very powerful element, as we saw with the Israelis and their exploding pagers in the Hezbollah network. The technology can achieve great, powerful impacts, and yet it is not necessarily the deciding factor. Look at the Taliban defeating the United States. How could that possibly have happened? And yet it did. You have an unending conflict between different societies.
And do we get involved? That's the question that came up in 1940, 41. It certainly came up in 1718. Wilson decided yes, because, and he had his reason, Roosevelt decided, well, maybe not, but then maybe yes for a while. And finally, Pearl Harbor and then Hitler declaring war made it easy for Roosevelt to get over the gap. Here we are again with the same gap. Is that a decision the American people want to make differently? Or are we going to go along reluctantly one more time to be those invaders from Czechoslovakia with bronze arrowheads?
If you're going to be the invader, as we were when we crossed the Atlantic and Pacific,
Which
and
we would be
destroyed
again
and
if we put NATO troops into Ukraine. We're the invader.
yeah, but I'm talking about World War II. When we
Okay.
destroyed Germany and Japan, we were in a position where technology and raw economic power
Right.
tipped the scales. And that created a narrative. And that narrative was so overwhelming to Americans, and it still is, to the point where we could never accept that we could be defeated by the Taliban, that we would have to leave Iraq and ultimately, as we must, Syria and maybe Mali and other places where it's just not sustainable. We have put all of our hopes on the decisive power of technology, and yet technology doesn't always rule. Even the Romans found that out. I mean,
Are we going to get involved again? Are we going to put troops into Ukraine?
we've been in Ukraine at the technology level, and it's failed. We will not put troops in Ukraine because Ukraine is going to collapse in the next several months, and the U.S. is going to be in a position, I think, following this massive defeat, that we are going to have to at last rethink what we can do with our military. I mean, we're facing a situation with China where we have no possibility of succeeding against Chinese military capability. We're looking at a situation with Iran and everything that's going on in the Middle East where we understand, or should understand, that we we can't do anything. A mighty carrier with F-35s and incredible missiles is not going to best the Houthi. The Houthi cannot be defeated because they do not recognize defeat. And a wonderful American diplomat, Ryan Crocker, who really knows the Middle East, said, "You can't defeat an enemy who does not accept defeat. You can only defeat an enemy when they say, okay, I've been defeated." And this is something that America simply does not understand. And in large part, our obdurate understanding of war was cemented and sealed up by our experience in World War II, where we forced the Japanese and the Germans to cry uncle after we slaughtered them in the millions and destroyed their societies.
Germanicus, you've been using the Middle East. That is not something I have as an example. And I have only Eurasia as an example. Yes, there's the Pacific as well, and that would be a reproduction of the Japanese War. But I'm looking at Europe in particular.
Yes. Okay.
We get involved in Europe. I mean, getting involved in Syria is qualitatively different than getting involved in Europe, where there are battle lines that are successful. I mean, just sovereign states.
Well, we have been involved.
We're being invited again and again. The victory plan was again that they were in Germany
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the president attended. Oh, we're being invited. Now, everybody agreed we're not going to go to a foreign war. That was 1940. They were all agreement. Roosevelt ran on it and he won on it. And yet we did. So we're now in agreement with what? We're going to go? We're not going to go. Europe, just Europe, not Middle East.
We can't go, and we won't go because we're U.S.
All right.
forces to be inserted into Ukraine in a kind of World War III. A, they'd be defeated, and B, there would be a massive escalation to God
We're
knows
about to
what.
change administrations. Is that significant?
It is because a new administration that was not a blue administration would probably find a way to end the war quickly.
There's a 50-50 chance it will be a continuation of Mr. Biden's foreign policy. Will we get involved?
No, it's not possible. We don't have our military understands, as a result of what it has seen in this war, that it cannot fight Russia and win. And General Cavoli, in Europe, a supreme commander, et cetera, has said so openly just the other day. In other words, it's finally emerging and finally being enunciated by American general officers and leaders that we created a powerful enemy in Russia, and we do not have the capability to take it on.
And we didn't have the capability in 1940 and 41. You know the history very well.
Right. And that's a very good point, because in 1940 and 41, the United States had 30% of the world's GNP and an even higher percent of the world's manufacturing, and a united country, thanks to FDR and the Depression. And we could mobilize and just ride roughshod over all of humanity. And fortunately, as the Redeemer Nation, we did so with altruism. But the fact is, we are not that country.
You're looking at it from results. I'm looking at it from the time that they were considering the conflict. And Roosevelt said again and again, your boys will not die in a foreign war. And the general opinion in America, everybody's entertained it, was the first war was a lie, that the only people that made death, you told me, the merchants of death. And they said they'll do it again. And
right. But the difference is Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor, yes, changed things. Yes.
It did. But today, let's just look at today.
There's no Pearl Harbor yet. There's no Pearl Harbor.
No, but if there was an administration, let's say the next blue administration said, we've got to take on Russia, and they actually made a move to mobilize in the US and introduce conscription, there would be a collapse in American society and a civil war.
All right.
I just think it's not a war. The war that was prosecuted eventually, called World War II, was a national war. And you cannot conduct a whole of government war where an elite conducts a preferential,
that's what it
narcissistic war. It won't work.
I'm pulling you back to 1940. It didn't look that way in 1940.
Right. And what I'm saying,
and the opposition to Roosevelt was strong. Bora was opposition. For heaven's sakes, there were major members of the Senate. Byrd was in opposition.
But we still had a heroic ethos. And the fact is, the war that's being prosecuted in Ukraine is being prosecuted by the therapeutic ethos. And the heroic ethos has completely denied and discarded that war as something.
Let's be determinative then. You say right now,
yes,
that we will not get involved in a European war.
We cannot. We don't have the ability.
Not cannot, will not.
Yes, we will not.
All right. That's helpful, because that's where we are in 2024, right before the election.
I guess part of my categorical response is rooted in the awareness that governments today don't want to go over the brink. For example, Israel really doesn't want to get into an all-out existential war with Iran, and Iran certainly doesn't want to get involved in an all-out existential war with Israel. Russia has been extremely cautious. China has been cautious, and the US has pushed things, but when it comes to a little kind of brinksmanship that might turn things and push things over the edge, we're unwilling to do that. In other words, I think the US elite today, in its deepest sense of self, understands how brittle it is.
1940, FDR, right before the election.
It wasn't brittle then. It wasn't brittle then.
He said very clearly, your boys will not die in a foreign war. So Harris and Trump, your boys will not die in a foreign war. We're right in that. We're right at that moment.
Right. Well, superficially, it looks similar. However, Wilson campaigned in 1916 on he kept us out of war.
Right. Your
And
boys will not
FDR,
die
as
in
you
a
were pointing
foreign
out,
war.
in 1940. But when the moment came, suddenly the nation, like a supersaturated solution, crystallized around the leader and
And you
became,
say that will not happen again.
it won't, it can't. We are a country foundering.
No, can is not what I want. What I want is it will not.
It will not. We're in an 1860
All
situation.
right. All right. I'm not asking for prophecy. We're just looking at where we are in 2024.
Cannot and will not, John.
What is that? 70, 84 years after the same moment with the
Yeah,
same. And yes, given technology has changed, but they thought they were modern at the time. They had radio,
well,
they
of
had
course,
telephones, they had cars, they had electrification was new. And
everyone is modern in their own time.
right. So will not. All right. Because we're going to turn now to the election. I've made a list and I could go through that. It's no need of the women who had power in the first century AD. And that was a long list. And they were very powerful. Livia of Augustus's time, Messalina and Agrippina the Younger of Claudius's time. Very powerful. And yet there was not the move into total power that is possible in this election cycle. Total power as in if Cleopatra had been successful. She was not. As if Agrippina the Younger had been successful. She was not. But there was a moment that it was an imagined possibility, imagined outcome in Rome. Is that possible in the 21st century? And Germanicus, I don't ask you to account for the therapeutic culture. We're in one. However, if you're Empress of America, it doesn't matter what the culture is. You're Empress. Is it possible that we'll do what Rome could not do?
Women in Rome, and later Rome's successor, Byzantium, and then even in the Western Latin European Middle Ages, there were women who stood out as having amazing leverage, influence, and even a decisive capacity to shape events. And they were able to do so because women had power as a result of the nature of societies where, for example, in feudal Europe, women could be in a position where they had, like Eleanor of Aquitaine had an entire duchy that was the most powerful and prosperous place in all of Europe, and thus had enormous power. And in our world, which says that, oh, it was the world of the patriarchy until today, and women had no say, that is not just a lie, it contravenes the reality of the historical record. And you had very powerful women like Boudica and Zenobia of Palmyra, who were tremendous leaders. And so there is no bar to women doing that today. You could see in the 18th century even that you had Maria Theresa and Catherine the Great in the Seven Years' War were the main protagonists fighting against Britain and Frederick the Great. And then later, you have Margaret Thatcher, Indira Gandhi, um, Golda Meir, who were tremendously powerful rocks of their nation in times of crisis. So yes, that is a possibility. One of the most interesting elements of the situation we inhabit today is, I would suggest, that the therapeutic ethos does not allow for heroic women to reach the kind of place where they can perform as their antecedents did centuries and millennia ago.
I'm
So
using
that so that you would,
Roman examples, Germanicus, when you use
yes,
Eleanor of Aquitaine, that doesn't help. Roman examples in the first century AD. The emperor system made whoever was in concert with the emperor very
yes,
powerful.
yes, yes.
I don't think Eleanor of Aquitaine had that kind of power. She did regionally, but not across in the Mediterranean.
Oh, she did though. I mean, she completely dominated her first husband,
All right,
Louis.
I give up.
Oh no, I'm just saying. I mean, she was the
I want
foundation
to stay
of.
with Rome because Rome was the
No,
power. Eleanor of Aquitaine in northern France was not a power. It was a regional power. I'm talking about an empire.
okay. Well, there's a lot of parsing that can go on, but the fact is that in Roman times, which was a very patriarchal system, let us be honest, women were able to insinuate themselves into positions of power through marriage and their own personality. So Livia, for example, was enormously influential
Right.
as the partner of Augustus. The same was true of Theodora later on with Justinian in the
Yes.
sixth
Yes.
century. And so you have that precedent, but they were operating in a different context. And that is extremely resonant to that period. But today, we have discarded that kind of partnership. I want to bring up here, another partnership
All
that,
right. Quickly. Go ahead.
yes, well, you have Marie de Bourgogne and Maximilian, the scion or scion of the Habsburgs, and their marriage, which was a real love match, created the dominant Habsburg power that ruled most of Europe for the next century and a half. And she was a power in her own right because she had the most industrially developed part of Europe, which was from her father, Charles le Téméraire. It was Burgundy and
I
all
agree
the
with you, but
Netherlands.
you're not giving me
Yes.
my understanding of an emperor as a woman, an empress, ruling not because she's married to it, but because she's powerful. She's the
Oh,
thing.
the only example of that in prior times was Irene, who actually was not a Basileia, but a Basileus, and to some extent Zoe. I mean, these were unusual situations. Today, the problem, and I'm putting this to you as a proposition, that there are women who could be empresses today, but they are not allowed to be. And in fact, one of the reasons that you have a very weak woman like Ms. Harris, as opposed to someone who would be much more capable, like Tulsi Gabbard, is that the therapeutic ethos does not like the heroic, and that extends to heroic
So you
women.
don't think it's possible then?
Well, the therapeutic ethos is an oligarchic, consensual, collective, rule-based ethos that does not allow a single person to stand out. And
In
so,
our century, a single person stood out. They were mostly 21st century were pathological, but they stood out. You'd have to say Caligula stood out, Tiberius stood out, Claudius stood out.
but I think if you want an example of a leader who embodied the heroic ethos, that would be Margaret Thatcher or Indira Gandhi, for God's sake, or Golda Meir. And the fact is that the
Yeah,
dominant.
you're picking off parts of an empire. You're not
Okay,
picking off an empire itself. And so
no,
the
no,
answer
no,
I'm going to take from you is no, it hasn't happened yet.
no, and it won't as long as the therapeutic ethos dominates.
That's an answer. That's where we are. Now we have an election and we'll entertain it's a 50-50 election. We'll entertain if we're ready for an empress, not ruling because she's married to or because she's the daughter of, but as emperor for X number of years. Germanicus and Gaius, looking at the possibilities of these next weeks, the age of heroism does seem a stretch for, for Donald Trump. So
Well,
it's
opinions differ.
I'm smiling Germanicus. He's flipping fries in a McDonald's in California. That's somehow, I don't think Achilles was good. Patroclus, neither of them could get to that. Priam, Paris, I don't think. Ajax, can you see Ajax flipping fries? I don't think so.
Common touch, John, the common touch.
Agamemnon, at the cash register. I don't know. Germanicus is MAGA Vlahos. I am Gaius, John Batchelor, Londinium. We're off to, well, no, the theater's still closed. There's this virus going around, and the Londinium health authorities keep closing our entertainment on Sunday night. So we'll sacrifice to the great god Augustus. We'll say kind words to Livia, and then we'll go on home. Thank you.